on this title screen, in the front left here is my machinist. Her name is Panama. And this was a clear picture from our first end game clear in Final Fantasy. So my research, like Elizabeth said, the overarching question is, how do communities collaborate to respond to problems? And that's shown up in a lot of different ways in my research, thinking about needle exchange and about how we work in teams and about fan community, about teaching project management. One of the things that was really important in my own graduate program was Pat Sullivan teaching us to attune to and allow for serendipity in how our questions surface. Like the thing that might be your next research project sometimes comes from strange places. So in my pandemic life, I've been playing all these video games, which has led to some questions for me. So if you are a gamer, this will not be new information to you, or this may be something you have heard of. If not, this is just the wildest thing that happened. So Destiny 2, big online multiplayer game with many seasons and many players around the world. And they routinely introduce new content to their games. So earlier, or at the beginning of 2020, they kind of quietly, without a lot of fanfare, introduced a new event into an existing dungeons where players at the end of this dungeon that they'd been running for a while got a puzzle piece that was one piece of a new map. It had a rune on it. And what the community figured out very quickly is that those puzzle pieces were unique to users and that there were thousands and thousands of unique puzzle pieces that had to be assembled in order to complete the map. There was no infrastructure in the game that supported the community sharing and assembling map pieces. But because Destiny has this very community-centered group of streamers and guilds that work together and raid together, there's a very active community on Reddit. Within about 5 days, the community had developed infrastructure and methods to solve the map puzzle. So when friends were telling me about the story and were engaged in this process and watching it happen, I was really fascinated by how quickly they mobilized technology, built networks, figured out ways to authenticate and sort the pieces. It was very fascinating to me. At sort of the same time, a friend, the same friend who you have all probably heard me talk about, Maverick, was playing Final Fantasy and wanted me to come play. And I kept saying no because Final Fantasy sort of end game content looks like this. It's insane. There's 9,000 things going on at the same time. And I went, yeah, no, I can't do the thing. But I was watching them play a lot. And I was very interested in, for fights like this, these sort of end game raid content fights, usually teams of 8 have to communicate very specifically to do what is basically choreography, where they all have to participate in the fight in their role as a healer or a damage dealer or a tank that's supposed to take damage and manage the boss so other people can fight it. So lots of discourse specific language, very highly technical communication, which they were very surprised to find out about. Wait, our raid thing is TechCom? Yes, it is. Deeply coordinated collaboration, both through like tooltips that they shared, communication during the fight, somebody who's in charge of calling mechanics as they happen, and a lot of implicit knowledge and behavior that complicates team dynamics and outcomes in the same way implicit knowledge and sort of hidden understandings complicate team dynamics and outcomes in other spaces. So I'm very interested in sort of the collaboration that's happening here, but I am still not willing to play because this is insanity. Then one night, as I was watching them participate or watching them do status raid prog, I had lots of questions, like how do you know things like where you are in relationship to the boss and how much damage you need to do and things like that. And so Mav says, do you want to see the data? And oh no, this is how I became a warrior of light. It was not come play this fun game with a great story and learn to do fun stuff and come save Eorzea with us. It was, you have to see the data you can pull from this game. I was fascinated. There's several sort of plugin applications that have been created by users and third party, mostly entirely nonprofit or donation driven tools that have been created to intersect with Final Fantasy, because it doesn't create any of the structure itself for the players. So all of this got me stuck on sort of a question that is always true for researchers. Is this new hobby a research site? Or is it just a hobby, and can I just enjoy it as a hobby? But there's some questions that I really can't quite stop thinking about, including the similarities that gaming communities have with other communities as they respond to problems. Also, the ways that gaming communities are unique sites with their own complications and problems, and how addressing some of these problems could strengthen those communities. MMOs, massively multiplayer online games, and other collaborative community-based games are really bad at onboarding and teaching. The game scaffolds how to do your job or multiple jobs, but how to really collaborate for that end game content is almost entirely built by complex infrastructures within the community, and the tools that that community builds to fill gaps in what the game supports. And game developers rely on their community to solve problems that they cannot or will not address through UI. So it's not that game devs don't understand the problems or the gaps in their content, it's that they rely on communities to build this kind of content, which sometimes ends up in unintended consequences. For example, Destiny has fostered, through how gameplay works there, a very collaborative, interactive, communicative community, which means they could do cool things like the map with 1,000 pieces and know that their users would be able to sort out and solve that problem. But also, when they introduced a new mechanic to how PvP, player versus player sort of trial combat worked in the game, it took, and how players could earn rewards relate in that system, it took the community approximately an hour and a half to break that system, because they could communicate very quickly to set up ways to mark players, to make it faster, to earn rewards that weren't really intended by the structure of how the game developers set up play. So some questions that I'm thinking about right now sort of fall into 3 categories. And if you have taken, most of you, I think 512 with me, these categories will be familiar. Sort of the macro level, sort of cultural questions. And like I said, there are some unintended consequences to the ways that game devs offload resource building and UX development to the player base. Sort of meso level questions, which I think is where my most pressing research questions lie, are how do communities build resources, tools, and networks to support collaborative play? And what are the what can we learn from these communities? What are the potential gaps and silences? And whose voices get amplified and silenced? These are also questions that are, I think, interesting to players. I have had some pretty interesting discussions with players about these questions. And then sort of on the micro level of what could my research do, right? Who is it for? What does it do? How could really looking at some of the stuff with players in the community support more inclusive resource development? So really what I wanted this workshop to be about, and what I hope we get to talk a little bit about, or hope you have questions about, is what does this look like in process? If I have landed on this question or this problem that I think is interesting, what do I need to do next? What's the next mechanic is a pretty common raid thought process, right? What do I have to do next? What am I getting ready for? Because this work intersects with game studies and UX, I have a lot of reading to do to really make sure that I am joining the conversations that are already in process and not just going, hey, TechCom people can do games research too. I invented this new idea that you have already talked about in other ways. So I have some reading to do. I'm also really thinking, because I am thinking this as about this as a community engaged project, I need to spend more time talking to and engaging with people in the community about my questions. So what am I missing? What priorities are interesting to you? And also sort of where I'm hanging out right now and have had some sort of new thoughts about recently is what my research design might look like. I need to think more about how and where I recruit participants. My own games Discord is not really is a convenience sample, but it's not really an effective way to specifically engage a wide range of participants. And why would people who play Final Fantasy or play MMOs and do endgame raid content, what would the value for them be in participating? What does reciprocity look like here? And then the method that I think I might use, one of the problems of my dissertation research about HIV, the HIV outbreak and needle exchanges, was I approached it not unsurprisingly, like a TechCom researcher. I went, there's all this information. I have news stories and press releases and documentation from the public health departments and all of this stuff that I can do content analysis on and look at how the language changed and how it moved and what was important and what happened here based on the documentation. And I can use that analysis to guide my interviews. That was true in that it was very useful for me to understand how all of this information had sort of moved and accumulated. But what seemed most important to me by doing that textual analysis was not what was most important to my interview subjects. And it had made me have to sort of flip about halfway through my project where my focus was and what my questions were, because my textual analysis didn't really line up with what was true in the community. So I'm thinking about how I can flip that process. Photo voice is a method that notably Aaron Brock Carlson at West Virginia University has used for community engaged research. And basically how that works is you invite participants to take photos of contexts that are important to their work. She happened to be working with interns that were working in a program that was building like community organizing and learning how to do community organizing. So she gave them specific prompts and asked them to collect photos. And then you conduct, in her case, sort of focus groups or group discussions about those photos and use the photos as a basis to sort of think through what was important and what was happening in these communities. I think a version of that that asks participants to bring their own documentation and the things that are important to them to a conversation, rather than me collecting a bunch of documentation and then going, what is this? I want them to bring the tools and the things that they use. For example, there's lots of really slick like how-to videos and walkthroughs and tooltips that are great big spreadsheets with lots of stuff in them. One of the most effective guides we have in the fight that we're currently doing progress on in Final Fantasy looks like a Post-it note drawn in Microsoft Paint that is just like arrows going, boss is here, you go here, and you go here, and you go here, right? So thinking about how the communities themselves can influence that research design is sort of where my ideas are living right now and what I'm thinking about. What I would like to do, or what I hope we can do for these last few minutes, is I was going to ask you to do some writing. And almost all of you have done some kind of something like this with me before. I'm going to put a link in chat really quick. While I am doing that, does anyone have questions or things, projects that they are working on, or stuff that they wanted to talk about? Like, anybody have something that they're like, hey, I really want to think about this thing. Can we talk about it a little bit? While I am pulling this up. So I only shared it with Elizabeth. That's not going to be useful. Hold on. Let me try that again. So to facilitate discussion in this weird Zoom space where I can't just put you into breakout groups, I created a Google Doc. And what I want to ask you to do is, for about 5 minutes, is there a place in this discussion? Elizabeth, there's not that many of us, and almost all of you have been in these conversations with me in some way. So I think we can just do it this way, and I think we're good. I want everybody to take about 5 minutes and think about, is there a place in this discussion where you have questions or ideas or stuff you want to talk about? So did this discussion about games research make you think about something, or do you have a suggestion or question? Is there something that you can't stop thinking about that you want to talk about a little bit and think about how it might be a research question? Are you working on a project where you are stuck in your own design process, and do you want to talk about that? And if none of those things fit, maybe at least just share with me and with us, what's your best new thing? Have you learned something really cool today? Are you playing or doing or listening to something awesome? What's lighting you up? Best new things always make me excited. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to write in the document, and then we'll do a few minutes of breakout discussion before we wrap up. While you're writing in the document, I'm going to get more coffee, because you all know me well enough that I'm going to go get more coffee. I'll be right back. Isabella, it's great to see you.
It's great to see you too. The portfolio that I worked on for 425 literally got me my full-time job. So like, thank you.
Oh my God, that makes me so happy. If you are, it looks like a couple people are just joining us. I'm gonna put a link to the Google Doc that we're working in right now, where we're sort of having a conversation about research design and starting a research project. I will also put in the chat a link to the PowerPoint presentation in case you want to go back and look at it. So the first link is the doc we're working in right now. And what I would like to do Isabella is listening to 99% Invisible. I haven't listened to that for a while, but it's almost always great. So it looks like people are having a chance to talk a little bit in the document. Is there anybody who is willing to share what they're thinking about or talk about what they're working on right now so that we can sort of workshop it as a group? Anybody brave? Or if you have a question for me about the presentation or my own sort of process that you want me to talk about.
So if we don't, I'll throw this out there, we can or cannot come back to it if other people have specific things, but Corey, Allison, and I have been talking about making a website focused on communicating various aspects of science, probably environmental science, right? Focused on climate and environmental issues. And we're having a hard time figuring out what exactly to focus on and like how to research that and make it practical.
Cool. So tell me, so some of Corey, Allison, and Elizabeth, right? Is that the three I heard?
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So my first questions are always the same. Who is it for and what do you want it to do? Who do you imagine your users are?
I feel like when you talk to any one of us, it's going to change a little bit because I think we all have so many ideas about what it could be that it's a little bit hard to focus, which I think is probably our primary problem, if that makes sense.
So if you're all working in sort of different areas of climate or environment or science communication, what kind of website might lend itself? What ideas have you thought through, or what ideas have you talked about how you might want to create that space?
So I feel like Elizabeth might be able to talk about this a little bit more, but I know she cares a lot about like legislation and maybe political ends of an issue, and maybe, and Karina will have to speak for herself, but Corey and I both kind of lend towards the educational aspect of things, which is, this is kind of an extension of my capstone too, where I guess my feeling is if we give a lot of resources for educators, it makes that initial conversation of do we even understand what's going on here a little bit easier. I think if there are good resources for teachers or for people who are just curious about these kinds of topics.
Yes, I agree. I would lend more towards the, the K-12 education. I love Allison's project. Super excited for it. So any chance to get my hands in there.
So there's so much connection between networked connection between policy and education in so many ways. As Corey, your project has made very clear, right? Your capstone project. I'm calling out Corey's capstone project because I got to read it. I'm one of the advisors on that project. One thing that I think about off the top of my head when it comes to what might a web space where we start to think about how we might work together looks like is a pretty traditional blog space, right? Where your main page might set up some of the main things that you're interested in, your own identities as scholars and practitioners. And then if you create blogs and tags that would allow you to talk about specific topics, then you could start to create some of the things that you're interested in and want to share. And then you have to think about how and where you share that information, right? How do you get to the audiences that you are interested in and drive traffic, right? So then it becomes a question of content management, right? As much as anything. That would be my first thought. Does anyone else have ideas or thoughts about how to start organizing a website around science communication and education and policy? Is that helpful in any way to the three of you? I don't know.
Yes, I would say that's very helpful.
I would say that does a couple of things. One, it would give all of you sort of an ongoing place to build a professional identity and keep working on some of the ideas that are important to you from your capstone projects and from the things that you are working on, sort of regardless of what your next job is. It would help you sort of keep building that professional identity toward the areas and the things that you want to work on, even if they're not directly related to the job you do next, which I think is a valuable thing to think about, and would allow you to manage how much time you invest in that, right? Especially if you collaborate, so you don't have to be the only person that's creating blog entries or the only person responsible for content management. I think that's a really sort of innovative and interesting way to approach that, to help you showcase each other, to help you share with each other's audiences and look for ways to connect that blog to wider audiences. I think that's an interesting way to think about portfolio and professionalization after graduation, which is where all three of you are, I believe. You're all in capstone this semester. Does anybody else have a thing that they want to talk about, a project that they're working on? Ingrid, thank you for joining us. I just put a link, or there are links. Can you see the links in chat, Ingrid? Or would you like
yeah, I think I'm in the wrong room.
That's okay, but hello. We're talking about research design.
It sounds wonderful. I just need to figure out how to get back to my main room. I'm sorry.
It's okay. In the bottom right corner, there should be a blue leave room button.
All righty. Thank you.
Yep. Anybody else? Something I said that you want to talk more about? Something that you're thinking about that you want to talk more about? The best new thing that you're in love with right now?
So there are some questions about your research in the Google Doc that you shared.
In the Google Doc, I could just read them. Yeah, Deja, I do think I have to look at text first. And I'm actually, there's a lot of just sort of swimming in what is being produced and how the communities interact that I've had to do as a participant, with always kind of an eye on what it might look like for research. It's a tricky part of community engaged research to be a participant researcher, right? It's valuable to research communities that you are already a part of. It makes it feel a little bit less like You are studying people like bugs in a jar because you are one of the bugs in the jar. So my perspective is a little bit different. I've had to do a lot of just learning language. There is so much I didn't know that is specialized language to this kind of gameplay. That's like learning any job. It's really super interesting. Oh, that's a good question. I don't know who asked how did you adapt when your project changed direction without losing everything? This is a really important thing to think about as a researcher, and is something probably most of you have experienced on some scale as you're working, right? When I realized that the content analysis I had done raised some very important aspects of the problem, it made those visible to be like, look how this language changed, and look how people who were enacting policy sort of picked up and adapted language that is central to harm reduction, right? Related to, so I looked specifically at needle exchange. But the thing that I learned by doing my interviews that was interesting was how communities were able to take up that language and engage in syringe exchange and in their communities was unsurprisingly sort of at the back end of my research, but wasn't something I noticed at the beginning, already driven by community organizers on the ground. The most successful needle exchange in Southeast Indiana was in Bloomington, and it was because a year prior to the outbreak, there was already a group of community organizers on the ground figuring out how to do sort of underground syringe exchange, even though it was illegal in Indiana. And that group ended up leading the syringe exchange program once it became legal in Indiana. So it wasn't so much saying, oh, all of this content analysis wasn't valid. It was figuring out the relationship between the new things I have learned and that content analysis, and really synthesizing what my perspective as a technical communicator brings to the conversation. So in a research project where you feel like, oh, you have everything I did just shifted, there's two ways I think you can manage that sort of that sort of problem, right? One, if it takes your research down a left turn where you go, oh, what I really should have studied is this thing. And I have had this conversation with some of you. Cool, put a pin in that, put it in your conclusion and say, well, the next time I study this, I'm going to talk about this thing, right? And finish your analysis and finish thinking through what is important about what you have found, right? Because I was working on a dissertation and not a seminar paper or a thesis, I could do both things. I could say, here is what the content analysis did. Here is how my interviews changed my understanding. And here's what the synthesis of those things look like. It became 3 different chapters in a dissertation, right? But in projects that aren't book length, right? Framing becomes really important, and understanding that one research project doesn't have to be the end of a project. You can work through the idea and the initial questions that you had and pick up the next idea and the next project. People whose job it is like me to do that kind of work, I get to be grateful for those opportunities where I go, oh, this was really a whole different project that I could have done and didn't. Because great, I can say this is the next project, right? So framing becomes really important. And the other thing I will say about this, that many of you have heard me say before, keep your research questions central. And if you put them on a giant post-it note sign over your desk or wherever you're working, and if you encounter something that is interesting or important or valid and that you think needs more attention but isn't related to your project, awesome. Put that on the shiny stuff that I will think about later list, and stay focused on the work that you're doing, which is sometimes very difficult, but is very important. Any other questions about that? I feel like I'm talking a lot. This has just turned into Dr. McMullin lecture 101. Any experiences, ideas, thoughts about how you have sort of reined yourself back in when research has gone in weird directions?
I'm just really bad at it. So shout out to you for keeping me on track.
You're not really bad at it. You just have to pay attention. You know when you have gone off into the wild somewhere. You just have to rein yourself back in. It's not a whole new project. I think one of the tendencies, we tend to find ourselves in technical communication because we are detail oriented, we are process oriented, we are problem solvers and explainers. So when things take a wild left turn, we feel like we broke the thing. Oh, well, then this is not how it's supposed to work. It doesn't go in the line it was supposed to go in anymore. And we have that tendency to say, well, we're just gonna throw this whole thing in the trash and start over then. This didn't work out. That's not how research is. Not like when you screw up baking a cake. Like, that's not how it works. You can sort of recalibrate and focus on what is valid and important about the questions and the research methods that you have, without sort of feeling like you have to start over every time you find a shift, right? But you also can be flexible, right? I figured out how to integrate what came out of my interviews, which was very different than what I expected, right? That's the nature of community engaged research to a certain extent. And I wrote about it in my methods. I wrote about it in my discussion. Here is what I expected to happen. And here is where things went wildly off the rails, right? I think transparency is valuable. And when things don't work as you expected them, that is a invalid part of your research, right? Entire scientific papers got written about how this didn't work, right? We did not get the results that we expected. So here's the new question, or here's the next thing. That's important. Anybody else thoughts, questions about working with a There's a question here about what's important when starting research with a new community. First of all, I do play Final Fantasy, and I don't think I could research in that specific area without becoming a player. There's too much that I don't know or wouldn't understand. And I think this is an important part of all kinds of community engaged research. You have to engage and build relationships with that community in order to work there. So listening and doing is important. For example, if I want to build on some of the public health informed research that came out of my dissertation, one of the things that's been really hard for me in the last couple of years is I have to build new relationships and put down new roots in this community, right? My first year in Raleigh, I was a new professor, and just keeping my head above water was all I could do. My second year, I have not left my apartment except for like cat food for a year, right? So I haven't spent time volunteering at a syringe exchange or at a free clinic or at any of the places or working with any of the nonprofits that are doing public health outreach in Raleigh or in my area. If I want to do that research, one of my obligations as a community engaged researcher is to participate and listen first, right? A lot of community research, or one of the problems of community engaged research, is to sort of drop in as an expert and go, oh, well, let me tell you about how to fix all the things or how to do the things you're not doing. This happens a lot in TechCom research because we do have specific expertise that we and we can see different kinds of problems or see problems differently than other organization people in the organization might. The problem with that kind of research is how often it silences the voices in the community rather than amplifying the knowledge and expertise of people on the ground responding to problems, especially with a social justice aspect of research, which games research seems pretty low stakes, but there are some real social justice questions there too about whose voices get amplified and what kinds of players are valued and included. But I don't know how to do this work without participating. So how do you work with a community? First, you listen and learn and volunteer and figure out whose voices you can amplify and support that are already doing effective work. That's at least how I am thinking about and approaching sort of community engaged social justice work, right? If I want to work on anti-racist community building in Raleigh, I don't get to be the white woman who goes into those spaces and says, hey, I have all of this expertise, let me put it on you. I get to say, which door would you like me to hold open? What thing can I do? Where can I make myself useful while I learn? Because it's not, there's a lot of people who do community research or community analysis without being part of the community, and it's almost always not good. Or it's almost always problematic in how it silences or doesn't contribute to the communities we are trying to engage. I think I am at time. Yeah. Does anybody have last questions for me? All of you all know where to find me if you do have questions or stuff you want to work through as you are working on research or capstone or whatever's next. For those of you who still have capstone coming up, I'm happy to have those conversations as we move forward. I love you all. I miss your faces. Our semester's almost over. Go us.